I saw the power of this platform years ago, even before I started being active. So 2 prompts to help if you're like, well, I just don't even know what to say. 2 prompts that I love. One is a question I asked today, and the other is a question I answered today.
What are the 4 pillars of thought leadership?
One way that you can see kind of how much credibility you have is how often you're asked to cite your sources versus how often you are cited as the source. The first thing I would not do is buy a platform and tell everyone they have to register and then just tell them to, like, share, comment, whatever, on whatever is in the platform.
What's like non-obvious in terms of what it takes to do human-centered marketing, or how it's different to actually what most companies do today? All right, before we dive in, you're listening to the Executive Brand Podcast with me, your host, Thormeier. Each week, I sit down with top B2B CEOs, executive, and founders to break down their playbooks. If you've not yet, it would really help if you subscribe or follow the show, because it helps us get on better guests and create better content for you guys. All right, let's dive in. All right, I'm here with Ashley Faus, the head of lifecycle marketing at Atlassian. Atlassian is a publicly traded B2B tech company that owns a suite of developer and collaboration tools like Jira, Confluence, Trello, Loom. They're doing about 3.5 billion in ARR and have about 15,000 global employees. Ashley also recently published a book called Human-Centered Marketing, How to Connect with Audiences in the Age of AI, that features 3 frameworks to help marketers build trust and attract, convert, and retain customers. And she's also, that's what I saw on LinkedIn at least, a passionate cupcake baker and fitness enthusiast. So thank you for coming on the show, Ashley.
Yeah, thanks so much for having me.
The reason why I wanted to have you on is because I love your content. I think you're doing an incredible job on LinkedIn with your content and your executive brand. And you're obviously doing it while being a leader at a very big company. So I wanted to explore all such things and more. Maybe as a first question, what is your personal reason for why you're so active on LinkedIn?
So I get this question a lot, actually, and there's not some grand plan of like, oh, am I going to open a consultancy, or do I want to ultimately become, an influencer, and get paid to do LinkedIn? And the real answer is, one, I enjoy it. I like to connect with other marketers. I think the conversations are interesting. I learn a ton there. It keeps me sharp from a skills perspective. 2, I fundamentally believe that the way to continue to stand out in your space is to stand out in your space. And I know that's a little bit circular, but I hear this a lot from people where they're like, I want to speak on a stage, or I want to get on a podcast, or I have this super smart idea. Why isn't anyone paying attention to me? And it's like, well, are you putting yourself out there for people to know that you have this idea, right? And so I've always enjoyed speaking. I've always wanted to be perceived as an expert in my space. And selfishly, I want marketing to work the way I think it should work. And so I can't influence how my craft works. I can't influence the conversation about marketing. I can't meet other smart marketers to, adopt their ideas and exchange ideas and get them to adopt my ideas if I don't show up. And so that's been something for me, sharing on LinkedIn has been a great way for me to share my ideas, have that influence, and really position myself as an expert in the space.
Was there any specific moment or experience that triggered you to take the step to actually start doing it? I don't know if you maybe spend some time on the sidelines, looking at other people and debating whether you should be doing it too, or whether you eased your way into it, but what triggered actually doing it?
For me, the initial trigger was actually because I wanted more speaking gigs. So I also do, my bio says, marketer, writer, speaker by day, and then singer, actor, fitness fiend by night. So I really love public speaking. I know that's weird. A lot of people hate it, but for me, I actually really love doing presentations, being on the stage, those kinds of things. And I wanted to do more of that. So I actually went the opposite way. A lot of people build a social following and then they start speaking. For me, I had actually done a couple of speaking engagements and I was like, man, how do I do this more? And I realized one of the things that a lot of conference organizers look for, especially at bigger conferences or on bigger stages, is that social media following. It's like do you have something interesting to say? And can you potentially help drive registrations for the conference? So I actually went the opposite way. I was like, I want more speaking gigs, and people are going to look at LinkedIn and at the time Twitter to vet whether or not I'm worth bringing on as a speaker. So that was kind of more the thing. I actually got serious about it a couple of years ago and was like, okay, how do I start building that LinkedIn following so that I can attract more speaking engagements? But yeah, that was actually what it was for me. I had been dabbling in it for a while, but I was still doing the like, here's a blog post. I'm just going to retweet or repost what somebody else says. I wasn't really commenting. I wasn't really posting. I wasn't really doing things, putting out a specific point of view. It was kind of more just like regurgitating and lightly curating some content. And once I realized the impact that building a following could have on getting speaking gigs, that's when I was like, all right, I actually have to have something worth saying if I'm going to show up. And so that's when I kind of started getting serious about it.
The meme comes to mind where it's like social anxiety is scared of her. I hate public speaking, but I respect that. Now, and maybe you don't think about that at all, but I think a lot of people think in terms of, I have an employer, right? You work at Atlassian. What will they think about it? How does it impact my role there or not? Will they appreciate it that I'm driving maybe some eyeballs, or do they actually not like it at all? What is your relationship with that, and how do you think about it?
So I think I'm in a bit of a privileged position, but I think it's not that unusual, particularly in SaaS, where there's no restrictions on it, right? I'm not in a heavily regulated industry. I'm not, in medicine or in finance or something like that, or in the law, where there's a lot of restrictions on what I can say, how I say it, etc. So I've been pretty fortunate for my whole career to work for companies that are, not only don't discourage it, but they encourage it or they see the benefit, right? So early in my career, I worked at an aviation company, and this was when LinkedIn was kind of just starting. Social media wasn't such a big deal. And I actually brought LinkedIn into that company, and I was like, guys, our sales reps need to be on LinkedIn. We need to be showing the people behind the brand. And one of our VPs at the time, he was like, who's even on this? And so he starts looking for his colleagues from like 20 years ago, early in his career. And he found somebody who is now at a huge company, pinged him on LinkedIn, ended up having lunch, and got this huge purchase order off of the lunch. And so I kind of joke, I'm like, oh, I drove $1 million PO from LinkedIn. And it's like, okay, well, he had the relationship. He just didn't have a way to reconnect with that person. And so I saw the power of this platform years ago, even before I started being active. And so once I went to Duarte, they had an official policy, and the policy was like, yeah, post, share, don't say things that are secret, don't share our proprietary information, but yes, go out and share. And that's been the case throughout my career. Atlassian's the same way. Obviously, we do have some restrictions on what we can say, right? Like, don't share proprietary information, only share things that are public. Don't say things that are bad about the employer,
I think forward-facing statements as a public company, you can't talk about, prospect of what the company will be doing.
Yeah. So, I mean, and that's true. I think that's true for any public company, right? Like, there's a list of stuff that you can and can't say because that is proprietary to the company. And as an employee, you have access to information that the external world can only have in certain contexts, right? But for the most part, it is good. They recognize that it is good when their employees are out there talking about how we use our own tools, right? Like, we use Confluence, we use Jira, we use Loom every day. It's in their best interest to have someone out there speaking about it. In terms of, my IP and my ideas, obviously I use these ideas and I use these tactics as part of my job at Atlassian. And so again, it bodes well for them to have people out there saying, as a marketer at Atlassian, here's how I think and here's how I work. And there's a lot of benefits to that, right? Like, whenever I want to hire someone onto my team, if I have an open rec, I attract really high quality candidates because they know who I am as a leader. They know the types of problems that I work on at Atlassian. They understand what type of work environment Atlassian is. And it's not just the facade of what the company says that's highly curated. It's, no, I'm a real human. I speak about these things. So in this case, it's not that Atlassian tries to dictate what I say or how I say it, but they do receive a benefit from me being out there and open and sharing. And obviously, there are times where if we've got big company announcements, for example, when our tool Rovo GA'd became generally available, they're like, all right, employees, like go tell everybody that Rovo is now available, right? So I think there's definitely a balance, and I think if you're in a regulated industry or you've got compliance issues, that's a very different situation. You shouldn't flout those rules because they're there from a legal and a privacy and a compliance perspective. But I think that it is in everyone's best interest, both the employee and the employer, to have people out there talking about real problems and building that trust with the audience beyond just what the official platform of the company is.
What would your tips or advice be for an executive, maybe at a larger company, who wants to be more active on LinkedIn?
So the first step is to just start. I think a lot of times people get so concerned. They're like, I have to have this perfect content strategy. I have to make sure that everyone from comms and legal and security and privacy and all of these people, that every single post I run by them. Again, unless your company has a specific policy stating that is not the case. Start sharing. So 2 prompts to help if you're like, well, I just don't even know what to say. 2 prompts that I love. One is a question I asked today, and the other is a question I answered today. And you could take that in any direction you want, right? So it could be, a question I asked today. I asked my, husband, what time are you going to be home for dinner? Okay. Why did you ask that question, right? How does it work where you've got 2 people with big jobs and you're balancing work and home? What does that say about work-life balance, right? Like a question you answered today. How did you find the information? Why did the person ask you that question versus someone else? What was the answer to the question, right? If someone comes to me and says, hey, Ashley, when are we doing this training? Okay, what's broken in our process that they had to ask me as a human instead of just looking at the calendar? Or, oh, I haven't actually scheduled the training yet. Or, oh, here's what the training is about. And here's why you as a team should be taking trainings like this, right? Those 2 prompts can take you in any direction. That's the first thing is, pick a prompt and start. The second thing is get involved in the existing conversations. So comments right now on LinkedIn are popping off. People are getting significantly higher reach on their comments than they're getting in some cases on their original posts. So go find the people who are already active, who are already having conversations about topics that you care about. If they're in your ICP, if you're trying to hire, right, other people that are talking about hiring or the talent market, whatever those conversations are, start leaving meaty comments. So you get 1,250 characters with spaces on LinkedIn in your comments. Use all of them. Leave meaty comments. Don't just come in and say like, this is a super interesting post. Okay, why? What about it was interesting, right? Do you agree? Do you disagree? Have you seen this? Give an example, right? So go get involved in those conversations. When you leave meaty comments like that, the other nice thing is you'll see people start to weigh in. Maybe they ask additional questions. You can then turn that into an original post. And so the tactic there is screenshot whatever the original post was that you were talking about, copy and paste your comment into the copy. And then if you ran out of characters, which I've done frequently, I've had to change the word and to an ampersand to save a couple characters, then you can expand on in the post and say, Finn recently asked me, how do I get started on LinkedIn? Here's the top 3 things I would say. Question I asked, question I answered, leave comments, turn those comments into a post. I literally copy and paste that into the copy. And then I could say, and, bonus, here's one additional thing. Talk about, your company's announcements, or if you went to a conference or something like that, an observation about the topics at the conference or the conversation at the conference.
Yeah. What I love about a question I ask and an answer I gave is that it anchors it in a real experience and a real story, anecdote, something that you actually did, which I think so often people end up pontificating or giving generic advice that's kind of comes off as preachy. But if you talk about, hey, I talked to my husband, I talked to my team members, they said this, I think it's a really great tip. Do you have any routine or rules around? I see you commenting a lot, and I actually wanted to ask you about that. Like, do you block off time for that? Is it you do it every now and then? Like, do you stick to any rules or routines there?
So, in general, my routine is the algorithm likes to see basically the algorithm wants you to warm it up a little bit. I call it priming the algorithm. So, in the mornings, usually I'll wake up, I'll comment a bit, and then I usually post right around 7:30 Pacific, right before I go to the gym. And so I've done my commenting, I've responded to any comments from the night, I've gone through the feed. I guess step zero, if we go all the way back to the beginning, is like curate your feed, right? Follow people who are in your ICP, follow people who are having conversations that you think are interesting. Don't just follow or try to comment on huge accounts like, oh, I need to find people with 1 million followers or 200,000 followers, right? Find the folks who are active and who are having interesting conversations that you want to be part of. So that's first step, curate your feed. Second, every morning, over coffee, I check my Slack, I check my email, and I do leave some comments for about 30 minutes or so. Then I publish my posts. I usually publish 3 to 4 times a week, and those usually go around 7:30 Pacific. That's a pretty standard time for me. If I've pre-written a post, then I've scheduled it for 7:30, and I do that because that's right when I go to the gym. And then while I'm at the gym, on the stairs or in between weightlifting sets, I answer the comments. So the algorithm likes to see that you've come back and you're responding to those comments, particularly within the first hour. So that works out perfect for me because I'm at the gym from like 7:30 to 8:30, and in between my sets, I can respond to comments. And it literally might be one comment, do a set of weights, leave one comment. Do a set of weights, respond to one comment, right? And then throughout the day, as I have time, so that awkward time for me as a manager, especially, I'm in a lot of meetings. And so there's sometimes an awkward time where maybe I've got a meeting, every half hour, every hour. And it's kind of like, okay, I only have a half hour. That's not really enough time to jump back in and do really deep work. That's a decent amount of time for me to leave a couple comments on LinkedIn, answer some Slack messages, answer some emails, leave comments on a page, give feedback to my team. So for me, it's more that habitual, it's a thing that I do. Oh, I'm waiting in line at Starbucks. Cool. I'm going to go ahead and just leave 2 comments. And I think sometimes people get so focused on like, I have to comment for 1 hour. I have to spend 15 minutes commenting. And if in that 15 minutes, you don't see anything worth commenting on, you feel like you failed versus just having it as a habit of like, pop in, see what you see, leave 1 comment, maybe 2, and then pop back out. It doesn't have to be this like huge focus block of I have to leave 10 quality comments in this 1 hour. Like that to me is way too structured. So for me, it's more building the habit, but I do have in that morning routine, that is very helpful.
And then for the 3 to 4 posts a week, do you just post what you think of in the morning at 7 a.m.? Do you have any sort of content pillars or structure that you refer back to?
So I tend to write most of my content on the fly unless I've got something like this podcast when it's like, hey, this podcast is going to go live on, Thursday. Great. I'll make sure that I've got it blocked out that I need to promote that podcast. But I have kind of loose pillars in my head. I don't really have a specific, like, on Mondays, we post about, marketing and content strategy. On Wednesdays, we post about leadership and management. On Fridays, we post the promotional post about the book or about whatever podcast or speaking engagement. I don't have it that structured. I find that it's a lot easier for me to post when I'm actually interested in the topic or I actually have something interesting to say. I do have some evergreen things that I go back to, but for the most part, I kind of post as things come up. I'm very fluent in my own content. So in the book, there's actually like a 3 Venn diagram of kind of how the frameworks overlap that I talk about. So rethinking the buyer's journey as a playground, the social media spectrum, and then the 4 pillars of thought leadership. And so I loosely align to each of those things. If I start to see that there's a topic that is interesting and I need to post more about, I'll test into that and then kind of add that into the pillars. And then I do occasionally have some random kind of wild card things where it's me being a human. So for example, if I have a musical theater show, every so often I'll post, hey, taking a break from my usual content. I'm doing a show. If you happen to be local to the Bay Area, I'd love to see you. But I don't have like rigid pillars that I post to.
I had that question for later, but given that you mention it now, what are the 4 pillars of thought leadership?
Sure. 4 pillars of thought leadership are credibility, profile, being prolific, and depth of ideas. So that credibility piece is really about, do people believe you when you say things? Do they think that you generally know what you're talking about? And one way that you can see kind of how much credibility you have is how often you're asked to cite your sources versus how often you are cited as the source. So when I first introduced this framework, for example, people were like, did you come up with this? Where did you get this from? How many other people are talking about this? Now that I've been talking about it for a while, I've written about it, I've spoken about it, talked about it on podcasts quite a bit. Nobody asks me that anymore. Nobody's like, who made this up? They're like, what are your 4 pillars of thought leadership, right? So that's the first one. Profile, this is kind of the fame piece. This is how big of an audience do you have? Do you have a lot of followers on a lot of social media platforms? Do you have a big subscriber list? Can you get into tier 1 outlets? Can you speak on big stages? Are you the keynote? Do you have a good time slot? How big is the room that you're in? Or is it, you're kind of just speaking on town halls, you're on tiny little podcasts, right? Being prolific, this is the only one that is 100% in your control. The others, all 3 other pillars, there's definitely a component of the perception of others about you or an external marker. Prolific is about how often you're showing up. So are you on LinkedIn? Are you on YouTube? Are you speaking? Are you writing? Are you doing long form? Are you doing short form? Different formats. And are you showing up frequently, right? So the folks where it's like, I'm going to show up and post on LinkedIn once a quarter with company news. Okay, well, it's going to be unlikely that you have a ton of credibility and then you're building a following if you're rarely showing up. And then finally, that depth of ideas. This is really about, are you saying new and interesting things? Are you innovating? Are you driving the conversation forward? Are you participating in the conversation in a unique way? Or are you just kind of showing up and saying like, here's the status quo. That's it, right? And it's like, okay, well, why would I follow you if you're not really saying anything interesting? So all 4 pillars have to work together in tandem. In a lot of cases, people kind of start at the bottom and work their way up. And again, they have to work in tandem, right? If you have no depth of ideas, it's going to be really hard for you to publish frequently and be prolific in order to build that credibility to, build your following. If you have no following, nobody's listening to what you're saying. So you might be being prolific, but nobody's listening. And I actually expanded kind of on this framework. It's called the 4 pillars of thought leadership, but I actually expanded it to assess subject matter experts, influencers, and thought leaders. There's this perception that thought leadership is the best. And the reality is that thought leaders serve a different purpose than influencers and subject matter experts. You can make a lot of money being any of those 3. And as a marketer, all 3 of those are valuable in the marketing mix. So we can obviously dive into that more if you want to, or if you've got other topics, we can pivot.
No, expand.
So the profile of a subject matter expert, these are usually the folks who are your go-to people internally. And in SaaS, they tend to sit in like a solution engineering team or a customer success team. They know the existing problem space really, really well. They've been solving this problem for 10, 15, 20 years, right? So they have very high credibility. They tend to have really strong depth of ideas because they're so familiar with the problem space. They tend to be able to come up with innovative solutions, but they rank low on that profile and prolific piece. They're not really out there speaking. They're not publishing on LinkedIn. They're not showing up much externally. That's okay. These people are actually great for sales trainings. They'll do demos, right? They solve the really gnarly customer problems because they know the space and they know your product so well. They are great for staffing booths at conferences, right? Because again, if anybody has a question about the product, they can answer it. They tend to be the authors on a lot of company blogs, right? They're primarily internally focused folks or user or customer focused people. They're not really out there building a big following. So that's subject matter experts. Influencers tend to be more forward facing. They tend to help you reach new audiences. So they tend to be a little bit lower in the depth of ideas. So they're primarily focused on existing problems and existing solutions. They tend to curate more at the tactical or strategic level. They're not really pushing the conversation forward, but they do have to have some credibility because otherwise they wouldn't have influence. And they tend to be most prolific in a single channel. So you've got Instagram influencers, YouTube influencers, LinkedIn influencers, right? These folks tend to be most active and have a big following in a single channel, but they're not really the ones who are doing the innovation and driving things forward. And then thought leaders tend to be strong across all four pillars. So they're innovating, they're driving the conversation forward, they're helping people think and act in a new way. So they tend to have a large audience. They tend to be bringing along both your existing customers or existing employees and helping you reach new audiences. But because they're so forward thinking, sometimes it can be a little bit jarring, right? Oftentimes people think, oh, we're going to do thought leadership for a founder or an executive. Okay, that's not thought leadership if someone else is just ghostwriting on their behalf, right? You can't outsource the thinking. The other interesting thing about this is sometimes it's almost better to have your thought leaders not be your founder or your executive, because part of the job of a founder or exec is to show the market we're steady, we're growing at a predictable pace, we're bringing people along on the journey. And because thought leadership is so forward looking, sometimes it can be a bit disruptive and it can feel a bit jarring, right? So it's interesting. You don't want to have your founder coming out and being like, the entire market that we built this whole company on is completely going to go away in 10 years. If you're an investor, that's real scary, right? Like you're telling me as a founder, you built this whole business and it's just going to be totally obliterated in 10 years. Like that's scary. What are you doing, right? Or as a user, as a customer, you're telling me you're fundamentally going to reshape the entire product? That's scary to me, right? Versus as a founder saying, we're going to bring you on this journey. Here's how we're moving forward incrementally. Here's where we see the future going, and here's how we're going to get there. If you're saying it that way, that's not quite as visionary as maybe you want to be, right? So there's some interesting interplay, particularly for smaller companies, in the steadiness that the founder or an executive, a CEO, needs to bring to both the customers, the employees, and the market, versus something that might be more visionary and really trying to push that conversation into the future, what a thought leader does, right? So you look at someone like Sam Altman, for example, OpenAI. Right now, the market is like hanging on his every word. But the people who actually have to do, and operate in the world that he's putting forward get very twitchy when they hear him say, different, very disruptive things, right? So there's some interesting interplay. And I think that as a company, particularly if you're larger and you're scaling, you actually want to have all three of those people. You want to have the subject matter experts, you want to have the influencers, and you want to have the thought leaders.
It seems to me, I mean, by definition, influencers are already prolific and active. You just partner with them. You want to get the right match. Thought leaders, you kind of got to be honest about you said the one thing that besides, you can't outsource the thinking. I think also just because an executive is creating content doesn't mean it's thought leadership, right?
Correct.
Because it might not be pushing the conversation forward at all. They might just be talking about what's working today, for example. It seems to me almost like the most underutilized part is the subject matter experts, where I feel like a lot of companies have these silent experts within their company, and they've not found a way to activate them more or get them to the surface. Would you agree or disagree?
I do agree with that. And that actually leads to kind of an interesting hybrid that I've talked about in the past called the internal influencer. And these are basically people who build their own following and build their own expertise and their own IP, but they're employees of the company. So you can have external influencers. These are what you see with, influencer partnerships, brand collaborations, etc., where this person is in the ICP, they have credibility and trust with the ICP, and they are not an employee of the company. Internal influencers, so the example that I give frequently is Laura Erdem. So if you look at Laura, she's got like 50,000 LinkedIn followers. She is the ICP. She's their head of sales in North America. She works for Dream Data. She is highly correlated with Dream Data, right? Like everybody knows Laura Erdem from Dream Data. She talks about how she uses the product in her own deal cycles in the exact way that the ICP would use the product in the deal cycles, right?
Yeah.
So regardless of whether Laura stays at Dream Data or not, she will still have that credibility with the ICP. She's a salesperson. She's got a great following of sales and marketing folks. She's now speaking on podcasts. She now writes. She now speaks elsewhere, right? She has built a following outside of Dream Data. But because she's employed by Dream Data and because Dream Data is relevant to her work, she also is a great spokesperson on behalf of the company. And so because of her success in social selling, LinkedIn, etc., Dream Data was like, hey, Laura, help the rest of the company build this. And so now she's started to get other executives from Dream Data more active on LinkedIn. They've now started to build a following. But if you're the founder or you're the CEO, it's much harder to separate you from the brand versus if you are just an employee of the brand and you're not in that C-suite. So Laura is a perfect example of somebody who, maybe she was a subject matter expert before. She started to build the brand and then and build her own brand. And then Dream Data was like, man, this is great. Let's make this more official. And so they've put her on billboards in Times Square, for example. They've run some Times Square advertisements and they put her on there versus just Dream Data or one of the execs. So she's a perfect example of somebody who started kind of in that subject matter expert bucket and then grew into that kind of internal influencer bucket.
And we'll link Laura's profile in the show notes below. I mean, but that's also scary to a company, no? When especially if you invest into that, right? Because as you said, Laura built an audience of 50,000 people, and that's to a large extent just her doing an amazing job and having interesting things to say. But especially if at some point you as a company invest into that even more and you pour money, budget, resources into helping that person build their brand, and then they might leave. And they might actually leave to a direct competitor of yours, and they take all that credibility and that 50,000 people audience that they build with them. How do you think about it?
Yeah. So there's a couple things there. I think first, I think it's a short-term and narrow view to assume that if we invest and they leave, it's bad for us as a company, right? So I'll give a perfect example. I worked at Duarte for about 4 years and I left, right? I still speak very highly of Duarte. Internally, if people are like, hey, we need a storytelling workshop, who should we go with? I'm like, oh, have you looked at Duarte, right? I have become the customer. I still refer people to Duarte. I still speak highly of them. I actually talk about Nancy and Patty and their work on the book Illuminate in my book, right? I cite them. Nancy actually gave me a blurb for the back of my book to say, hey, this is great. Ashley's a smart marketer. These frameworks work. So the assumption that just because someone leaves and takes that credibility is bad for the company, that's not necessarily true. They could be partners, they could refer other people, they could become a customer. So that's the first thing. I think the second thing, all of these things work together in tandem. If your sole, and this is actually a pitfall where kind of in that thought leadership for a founder, if the only people who can speak on behalf of your company, if you've only got one of those, you got a problem. It's the same thing, that's why we call it a marketing mix, because if you're all in on a single channel and that channel fails, has, an outage, randomly deletes your account or shadow bans you, right? Like their founder does something crazy and so now everybody runs away from that channel, you've got a problem. And so if you've concentrated all of that credibility in a single person, that's a bigger issue than what if the person leaves and goes to a direct competitor. So on one hand, that is a fear. On the other hand, I think that in the long run, it is more important to have credible folks speaking both on your behalf and also in a way that allows them to leave because they can continue to expand that reach. Fair enough if they go to a direct competitor, but again, we've kind of seen this, right? There's a number of executives. It's kind of funny. There was a chart years ago that I saw that it was basically like, the top 10 big tech, right? Like the FANG acronym changes occasionally. But it was like basically the movement of employees between all of the companies in FANG. And it's like it's just like a merry-go-round of all of these people are constantly going from, Facebook to Apple to Netflix to Google, right? And they're all just going back and forth. So years ago, someone said to me, I live in Silicon Valley. And so the comment was, careers are long and the valley is small. And that is true on LinkedIn and in the thought leadership world. I think it is better to invest and help people and support people as they build rather than trying to restrict them. Now, again, regulated industries aside, but we've seen this at Atlassian, right? Like we've had folks who, have gone on to other companies, they founded companies, they are advisors on boards. And the reality is at a certain size, people are going to leave and that's just how it works. But in general, I think diversifying off of a single founder or a single exec is going to be the right long-term choice.
Right. And I mean, I would also add, maybe there is the risk if you want to view it as a risk, but also are you just not going to do the thing that works in 2025 because there is a risk? And I think it's obvious at this point that posting through people on LinkedIn works a lot better than just posting through your company page where you might be able to keep all the followers that you accumulate.
Well, and it's interesting too, right? Like followers, especially for like scaling companies, are they following you just because they applied for a job? And when you do that on LinkedIn, it automatically makes you follow the company. Like the idea that all of the followers on a company page are the ICP and not investors or potential employees or partners, right? If you have a large partner ecosystem, maybe they're users, they're not even economic decision makers. Like the follower count on your company page, it's just a very small, like that's
Totally.
I don't know, man. I just think of it too. It's like, would you rather have more billboards or less billboards? And then if you have a billboard, are you going to throw a blanket over it? Like, of course not, right? You want the billboards to be seen. Your employees sharing generally improves, assuming they're not saying stupid things, which I don't think most people are, right? Generally improves the perception and the touch points, the relationships, that you're solving smart problems, you're a great place to work, you're a smart place to invest. If you're a partner or let's say you have an API or you want to do an integration, right? Like all of those possibilities. It's just better if you have more people out there sharing, engaging, building those relationships, having those conversations. And this is not to say that like, we need to make all of our employees post our company blog posts. Like, that's not the point. The point is people trust people like themselves. People buy from people they trust. People go to work for people they trust. People invest their money with people they trust. The more people you have out there building that trust, the more likelihood that you're going to have that rising tide raising all boats across all of the different benefits. And obviously as marketers, right, we're looking at that short-term conversion, buy my product. But from a company perspective, you have to be looking at the long-term investments, partnerships, hiring abilities, merger abilities, acquisition abilities, right? Like that longer-term view has to be bigger than just, will this person buy my product today?
Yeah. If you were in charge of building or implementing a company's executive thought leadership, if you want to call it that, employee advocacy program today, let's say a decently sized company, not a startup with 10 employees, how would you go about it? What would be some of the things you'd be thinking about or trying?
So this is a bit controversial. The first thing I would not do is buy a platform and tell everyone they have to register and then just tell them to, like, share, comment, whatever, on whatever is in the platform. I understand the need for scale for some of those things, and I understand there might be people who are willing but not able, and platforms like that can help those who are like, yep, I'll just blast the company message. For it to actually be effective, that willing but not able is a big thing. I no longer want to try to force people to join LinkedIn, do speaking engagements, accept podcasts, write blog posts, etc. If you hate it and you're terrible at it, why would I waste my time fighting with you, right? So instead, first thing I would do is go find the people who are willing but are struggling to be able.
Yep.
As a marketer, I am fluent in the skill of creating and sharing, right? So for me, this is very easy. I've worked with a lot of developers, software engineers, CTOs, etc., who are very smart, very capable. They're actually very good at articulating their point of view, and they have smart things to say, but they're not fluent in the skill of creating and sharing on LinkedIn, on stages, on podcasts. So in that case, working with them to say, what's your unique point of view? What key topics do you want to talk about? What formats do you like best? Do you like long form written? Okay, cool. Write out, maybe the step is you write out all of your long form posts, and then we come back and pair you with a marketer to help you adapt those into LinkedIn posts or into talking points for podcasts, right? So really understanding the folks that are willing, but where they're struggling to be able, and then pairing marketers in that way. So I think it's better to have kind of a handful of folks that you focus on versus trying to go broad and saying every single person needs to share, be active, etc. And then if I have it my way, I would pair like one marketer, one kind of generalist marketer, or one generalist comms person to maybe up to 5 people, like very, very small cohorts. So their voice, their content, you're able to go with them to the speaking engagements, right? You're able to have somebody who can edit and pull out the clips. Again, I find that from a repurposing standpoint, a lot of those, particularly from an exec standpoint, they don't have time to develop the skills. So focus them on developing the ideas and putting the source material together, and then pair them with somebody who has the skills to slice and dice it, etc. That's how I would approach that. So focusing in on kind of a small handful of folks who are willing, focusing in on the handful of folks that have smart ideas, and then pairing them in a very small, one-to-one or one-to-few with like a person with a generalist skill set to help transform the source material into a bunch of different formats so that it can go, in multiple places to build that profile.
I don't know if you agree with this, the way that I think about executive thought leadership versus employee advocacy. Executive thought leadership is more like from what I see, mostly a done with you, where you have someone hand holding you a little bit, maybe a marketer, maybe a comms person working directly one-on-one with the executive, bouncing ideas off of each other, etc. Where employee advocacy is more at scale and it's more a DIY. We'll just give you some tools and resources and coaching, but you SDR, you product marketing manager, you go out and write your own thing and do it all by yourself. Maybe you disagree with this, but how would you prioritize who gets that investment of hand-holding and a marketer or comms person dedicated to them, which obviously costs a lot more in terms of investment resources, versus we'll just give you some help and some insights and some coaching, but you kind of manage it on your own?
Yeah. So I think some of this does depend on the size and scale of the company. Obviously, at a company like Atlassian, with 15,000 plus employees, we cannot handhold every single person who wants their hand held. We could, like, let's say if even 1% of our company, let's make it easy, say 15,000, 1%. That's what is that? 150 people, right? Like, it is.
With your model, that would be 30 full-time people hand-holding each 5 people.
Each 5 people, right? Like, that's absurd. We clearly cannot do that, right? We have to narrow it down even further. So there's a couple things. I think one, you do need to have people at different seniority. And I think this is a pitfall. Often everyone goes straight for the C-suite. We want our CIO, CTO, CMO, CEO, CX, whatever the C-suite is. Those are the highest priority people. There's 2 pitfalls with that. One, as I said, it's often very hard for them to be thought leaders for a couple reasons. They're too busy to actually codify the ideas. They're running the business, they're running the org, etc. So it's hard for them to sit down and actually codify the source material to then share out. 2, in a lot of cases, they're actually quite far away from the core problem that the practitioners, the users, et cetera, are actually solving. So they actually might not have credibility with the audience that needs to have that credibility because they're so far away from the problem. And then 3, as we discussed, part of what they do is to show the market, show the business, show the employees that they're steady. By its nature, thought leadership is disruptive. It's not being contrarian for the sake of being contrarian. It's not being spicy for the sake of being spicy. But thought leadership is naturally disruptive. And in a lot of cases, a core job for someone in the C-suite is to be steady, right? Show steady forward progress. So yes, it's great to have folks in the C-suite that you are supporting, but I would recommend looking across people at different seniority levels who have credibility with the ICP that you're going after. And that's not just the final economic buyer who signs the checks. That's anyone who can influence the decision all the way down. So that's the first thing. The second thing is finding the people who are both willing and able, but maybe they've got the wrong title, right? And this is fairly common. I'm actually kind of a perfect example, right? I don't have a C-level title, and so obviously I'm building a following, I'm speaking, I like doing it. If you wanted to go after someone like me as your core audience, even though my title is not a C-level title, I would be an excellent person for you to pick because I am both willing and I am able. So expanding that view of saying, we're not going to force people who are neither willing nor able. If you're missing one of those, like, probably not the best people to go after. If you find folks who are willing and able, but maybe they've got the wrong title, cool. They can benefit from the company giving them that halo and giving them more opportunities, and the company giving them that opportunity to speak up and amplifying their content. So, it is a hard trade-off to kind of say, like, who are the right people? But I would say the folks who are willing and able, the people that have credibility with that audience and have already shown some momentum, and then making sure that you're looking across different seniority levels. At some point, you definitely have to have company spokespeople who are in the C-suite or who are, vice president and above. We'll expand that executive bench. But if you find people who are willing and able and who already have some momentum that would have that credibility with the ICP, don't be deterred by maybe a more junior title or sitting in the wrong org. Like, I see this a lot, especially at bigger companies. It's like, well, you sit in marketing and you're on the wrong product. Okay, well then put them over on the right product so it makes sense to invest that money, right? Like, that's an easy fix from an organizational standpoint. Don't be limited by where someone sits. If they've got the right persona, if they've got the right ideas, if they've already started to build that following, that's easy. Move them to another team, move them to another budget bucket. If the issue is, well, I can't spend my Finn budget on Ashley. Well, then just sit Ashley with Finn, and then you can spend the budget how you need to.
How would you measure a thought leadership, employee advocacy program? What's the right way to evaluate success?
Yeah. So I talk about this in my book. There's actually a chapter on metrics, and I talk about leading and lagging indicators and making sure that you're taking a holistic approach to both. The other piece of this is matching to intent. So as marketers, we tend to focus on two primary intents, buy intent and use intent. And the use intent piece is particularly important from a SaaS perspective to reduce churn. So churn is a lagging indicator, right? People might buy a bunch of products, they might buy the licenses, but if they're not using them, then eventually they'll churn, they'll downgrade, etc., because they're not getting value. So that's how those relate. But there are other intents. There's trust or affinity intent, which is what a lot of thought leadership helps you build. And it's a little bit of a circular definition, but it's like any content or any channels that help influence that perception of I trust you, I think you're smart, I like you, I think you're solving hard problems, you're doing the right thing, right? That is all trust or affinity intent. And then there's also learn intent. Now, for some reason, we have all decided that educational content is the best content, and so we twist ourselves into knots trying to turn everything into learn intent content. The reality is true learn intent content does not have a direct next action for the audience. Maybe they just think about what they've consumed. Maybe it's practices, right? Maybe they share on social media. So thought leadership often also falls into that learn intent bucket. So there's leading and lagging indicators. So some of the leading indicators might be shares. Lagging indicators might be follower growth or subscriber growth. Backlinks or citations. So getting tagged into a LinkedIn discussion. This actually happened this morning. Somebody was posting about a different model for thinking about the buyer's journey instead of the funnel. Multiple people tagged me and said, "Oh, Ashley, like you should talk about your playground here." That's a lagging indicator, right? That I have actually built credibility in that market and I'm showing up in that market. Citations and mentions in press, for example. So I often cite the Edelman Trust Barometer. It's a longitudinal study. When I commented about people trust people like themselves, they buy from people they trust. That's information, there's stats around that from the Edelman Trust Barometer. Me citing the Edelman Trust Barometer is one thing that they could measure to say, oh, how is our thought leadership doing? So direct measurement around, downloads of that report, entrances to the site. Obviously that makes sense, but as a lagging indicator, how often are they getting cited or referenced as part of that information?
Now, the lagging indicator you did not mention was revenue. And is that because there's such a long delay that to perfectly correlate followers, impressions, citations with ARR is just too long to make that connection?
So yes, it's too long to make that connection. And two, revenue belongs with buy intent, right? So
I see what you're saying.
Buy intent is anything that gets someone to give you money. So that's signups, that's request for proposal, that's contact sales. Thought leadership by its nature is not by intent. Like that doesn't make sense. So if we take my 4 pillars of thought leadership, for example, right? What would you buy from me with those? Mm-hmm. Like there's not, you might think about it, you might reference it, right? You might implement it. You might score people in your company on those different pillars, but there's nothing for you to buy. In contrast, if I say, go buy my book, well, now you're buying the book. The book is the thing, right? And yes, the 4 pillars of thought leadership are featured in the book. Maybe you saw or heard me talk about those pillars and you're like, man, she's smart. That's that trust or affinity, right? You trust what I'm saying. You think I'm smart. You have an affinity for my ideas. But in order to buy my ideas, you have to physically buy the book, right? So how would I correlate that someone listens to this podcast, they hear about the ideas, they're like, I heard you on this podcast, I decided to buy the book. Like most of the time, that is just not going to be that highly correlated where somebody is going to say, I heard your ideas, I trusted you, I liked your ideas. The 4 pillars of thought leadership framework is the thing that made me buy the book, right? So the other issue is when you try to say, like, we're going to do thought leadership for revenue, you don't sell thought leadership, you sell something that solves someone's problem, right? So when you start trying to force thought leadership to drive short-term revenue, you necessarily remove kind of the thought and the leadership piece of it, right? Thought leadership is about where we're going in the future. If I can sell you something that solves your problem today, then it's a buy intent item, right? Like it just at the point where you're like, we have this big grand vision and buy now. Like those just don't
I
make,
see what you're saying.
it's
That's
just a
really cool.
huge, yeah. So thought leadership is driving in the long run, the vision, the new actions. When you buy something, you are trying to solve a short-term problem right now. And so those have to be separate. Otherwise, you just end up with a thinly veiled sales pitch. You break the trust. This is why most people roll their eyes at the term thought leadership, because they're like, it's basically just a thinly veiled sales pitch. How much do you trust me if I'm like, Finn, the funnel is dead. You need something else. And you're like, are you trying to sell me something? No, I've just got an idea, right? And so we have this whole conversation. And then at the very end, I'm like, haha, you have to buy my book, right?
Right.
You feel,
Yeah, it cheapens it.
you don't
for
feel
sure.
good
Yeah.
about that, right?
Yeah. I get, yeah. Do you have time for one last question? I know we're
Yeah, I've got
basically...
time for one last
Okay.
question.
Now, the book that you wrote is called Human-Centered Marketing. When I was thinking about that, I felt like if you would ask the average marketer right now if they're doing human-centered marketing, my guess is most of them would say yes. What's like non-obvious in terms of what it takes to do human-centered marketing, or how it's different to actually what most companies do today?
So there's a couple of things that I say in the book that I think indicate this, right? To your point, most people would say, oh, we do human-centered marketing. And yet, if you ask them to talk about their marketing, they're going to say, we're looking at marketing influence pipeline, right? How many deals did we capture? How many leads did we acquire? That is very aggressive, right? Nowhere in there do you talk about the people. You talk about prospects, you talk about leads, you talk about MQLs, you talk about deals, you talk about pipeline. Where are the humans in any of that, right? Do you start a relationship with someone? Do you add value for a user? Or do you chase a lead? Do you capture, do you chase a prospect? Do you capture a lead? Do you lock down a deal? Nobody wants to be chased, captured, and locked down, right? And if you ask them too, right, how often do you actually speak to your customers versus look at your dashboards? How often do you do something because it's easy to show in a dashboard versus it's the right thing to do for the human behind the screen? And I've fallen into this trap myself, right? We'll start talking about something and the very next question is, well, how are we going to measure that? Well, how does that flow into the dashboard? Well, who actually gets credit for that lead? At the point where you're talking about who gets credit for a lead, you are not doing human-centered marketing. The reality is we should be solving problems for humans, right? That's what marketing is ultimately about. Understanding the problems in the market, taking that information back into the company to build solutions that solve those problems. And then once we have a solution, articulating that back to the market in a way that they understand that we have the best solution for their problem. And so when we start just focusing on our dashboards and our spreadsheets and our MQLs and our leads, and we completely take the people out of it, that's where we've gotten away from the human-centered marketing. So going back and saying it's not a linear journey, right? People are going to go up, down, and sideways. How do we empower them to do that in a seamless, delightful, and impactful way that solves their problems and drives that business bottom line? That's where we get back to the human-centered marketing.
I'm gonna let that marinate. I think there's a lot in there. Yeah. All right, Ashley, thank you so much for coming on. I learned a ton. If people want to connect with you, I'll link your LinkedIn in the show notes, as well as your book if people do want to buy it.
Yes,
Even though
but
we'll
in
focus
theory,
on...
they've learned something without having to buy.
So yeah, thank you so much for taking the time.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
All right, this podcast is brought to you by Project 33. Project 33 is the leading executive thought leadership agency for LinkedIn. If you're looking to activate your founder, your CEO, your executives, or any of your internal subject matter experts and create thought leadership content for them to build trust and credibility for your brand, reach out at project33.io.